my distinct honor to once again welcome Sandra Stotsky back to Germantown. Dr. Stotsky is currently serving as the Professor Emerita at the University of Arkansas, the Department of Education Reform. She is credited with developing one of the country's strongest set of academic standards for K-12 students, as well as the strongest academic standards and licensure tests for prospective teachers, while serving as Senior Associate Commissioner in Massachusetts Department of Education from 1999 till 2003. She is also known nationwide for her in-depth analysis of the problems in Common Core English Language Arts standards. Her current research ranges from the deficiencies in teacher preparation programs and teacher licensure tests to the deficiencies in K-12 reading curriculum and the question of gender bias in the curriculum. She is regularly invited to testify or submit testimony to state boards of education and state legislators on a bill addressing licensure tests, licensure standards, and Common Core standards. She currently serves on several committees for the International Dyslexia Association and on the advisory board for Pioneer Institute Center for School Reform. She served on the National Validation Committee for the Common Core State Standards Initiative, on the National Mathematics Advisory Panel, co-authored its final report, as well as two of its task group reports on the Massachusetts Board of Elementary and Secondary Education, and on the steering committee in 2003-2004 for the framework for the National Assessment of Educational Progress Reading Assessments for 2009 onward. I could go on. Her list of accomplishments is unprecedented. She is also the mother of 5 and the grandmother of 12. She has many major publications, including her most recent, The Death and Resurrection of Coherent Literature Curriculum, well worth your time to purchase and read. And she is also a double contributor to our recently released book, Common Ground on Common Core, another must-read. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Sandra Stotsky.
Introduction. I also have a new book coming out soon. It's been accepted for publication, and it will be dealing with specifically teacher licensing regulations and teacher tests. It's not a sexy book at all, but it's going to be, I hope, a very informative book, because that is ultimately what we have to start reforming if we ever want to improve public education. Let me first begin by finding out a little bit about the audience, who you are. How many of you, just raise a hand, have children or grandchildren in the schools, are here because of that? So that is the large bulk of you here. Are any elected or appointed officials, local or state, here? A couple of hands. Good, few. That is important, and it's just too bad we don't have a lot more like you. But the problem is, a good part, that our elected or appointed officials, for at least 5 years, have not been coming out in large numbers to learn about Common Core. I have been testifying before state boards or state committees just 2 weeks ago, actually, with a committee hearing in Georgia that I was WebExed into. I'm now learning about your more advanced technology than Skyping, because I have grown beyond Skyping. And I realized that Professor Milgram and I have been talking to state committees and others for almost 5 years, saying pretty much the same thing, only now we're getting a few better, intelligent questions from state legislators. They really had almost nothing to ask the government except what is Common Core, and they needed a grounding in whatever it was that their state board had elected. But it occurred to me that it's taken this long to start seeing a lot of action taking place. There are probably 25 states that have some kind of effort with regard to a bill or some movement going on in the state that's large, and I'll talk to you a little bit about that at the end. I'm going to start out first. This is the shape of what I'm going to do here, just to catch up some of you who may just need a little bit of grounding in what the basics are with Common Core. The audiences that were left out, the flaws in ELA, flaws in math, very briefly, where is higher ed, something about what we know at this point about the Smarter Balance test, and then a little bit more on ways out with a particular emphasis on what parents can do, because they are still going to be the center for action in the future. Gates has not been able to buy out parents, just about everybody else, but parents aren't organized, so he hasn't been able to do much with parents. PTA, separate story. The officials there did get some Gates funding, but it doesn't translate down to the local school level. But let me begin by talking about who were the major groups in this initiative, which was not state-led, and it didn't leave us with internationally benchmarked standards, research-based, or rigorous standards. All that misinformation that I have been told I am constantly telling everybody, but I don't know what other information I could tell everybody, because that is indeed why Professor Morgan and I did not sign off on Common Core standards when we were on the validation committee together. And let's see. Just do. All right. This is better than like waving something in front of you in any event. We have to remember that some of us were there from the beginning. I was being asked to comment from '09 on about the validation committee, about the standards by, among others, the New York Times, when it was interested in actually hearing a diversity of opinion. It no longer is, unfortunately. Common Core, as you may or may not remember, began as an idea in '07, '08. And it was all done pretty much behind the scenes. Very few people were involved. Then in '09 and '10, it was developed by 3 private organizations in Washington, D.C. We know them, and at least most of the media knows them by now. National Governors Association, Council for Chief State School Officers, and Achieve, Inc. And they were supported in this purpose by the Gates Foundation and Fourth Private Foundation, another private group, which is why no one can get any records on anything, because you're dealing with 4 private groups. No way to FOIA any one of them to find out why they chose the people they chose to be on the committees, 3 major different committees they had, what their contracts were, what they thought their qualifications at the time were. Can't get any of that information. It's all secret. Whatever they choose to give you is all they choose to give you, and you have to just figure out for yourself all the rest. First group that was not there were the parents. Nowhere to be seen on the original standards development work groups in '09. They turned out to be mainly people connected to the testing industry, which is one of the groups that's highly profiting from Common Core. Parents weren't there. They were certainly not on the validation committee, and standards writers were totally unknown to almost everybody in either field of math or English. So parents were not the focus of this at all, and still aren't. In fact, I think the USED and the Gates Foundation are rather annoyed with the grassroots revolt by parents because they don't know what to do with it. And that's why we keep hearing more and more of these little phrases like, the government's responsible for children, or children belong to their communities, as if the parents don't know what to do with their own children and can't be trusted. Parents were the first group that were ignored. The second group were, for the most part, our teachers. They have been stunned in the past 2 years in community after community to find out what they have been expected to teach to and to do in their own classrooms. Many good teachers, we don't have facts on this as far as empirical data, are leaving, retiring earlier, and unfortunately we will be having newer teachers coming in who have been trained in our schools of education, for the most part, which is where we get most of our new teachers, who have been told and taught to teach to Common Core standards, because that is part of the accreditation criteria for education schools. You just need to know that there are a number of nails going into the coffin of public education, and that is one that was completed last summer, a year ago, when the two accrediting agencies merged. They are now called CAEP, Council for Accreditation of Educators, and I forget what P stands for now, because these acronyms are all changed, but CAEP is the new private reaccreditation agency, and one of the criteria it will use is to make sure that teacher and administrator preparation programs train those who would become educators in our schools to know how to teach to Common Core standards and next generation science standards as well, even if they haven't been adopted yet by most states. So we have teachers who were pretty much in the dark, told after the fact that they were going to have a new set of standards that would transform education, leave them in chaos, in other words. And that is exactly what has happened. The third group, and that is the reason I have been testifying all over the country, are our state legislators who finally, a couple of years ago, it took them 3 years to kind of wake up, to realize that they didn't know about Common Core standards and wanted to find out what they were, what decisions their state board had made, and what they could do about it, if anything. And they're now trying to figure out ways to get out of the sticky jar of molasses that their state boards of education, composed of intelligent and educated citizens for the most part, who never bothered to consult with them and get a cost-benefit analysis or let them know what they were doing when they adopted Common Core standards. And in this case, you didn't have a state board of ed, you had one person who almost within minutes after the final set of standards was released in June, adopted them in the state of Wisconsin. State legislators, for the most part, knew absolutely nothing about this or what the costs would be. So they're the third group that had been left out deliberately. It wasn't desirable in the eyes of so-called reformers to involve those who would pay the bills at the state level or the local level. And the fourth group that was left out were your local school board officials. I was told in Massachusetts that they received a very brief letter after the state board adopted Common Core, letting them know that they would be now having a new set of standards in Massachusetts after the fact. So we don't know what happened in every other state, but we can assume that most of them knew very little, if anything, about what their state board, or in this case, your commissioner of education, was doing all on his own. Why is this important? Because Common Core has so many tentacles, and we're now beginning to see more and more coming out, that it would have been useful if there had been even the same amount of discussion that took place when your own state standards were developed. I was in Ridgewood, New Jersey several days ago, and we had standing room only of about 300, 350, mainly parents, who wanted to find out what Common Core was doing to their schools in New Jersey, because they had been told almost nothing and they were getting very anxious. And they didn't understand why their own elected or appointed officials could tell them almost nothing about what was going on in the school curriculum or why these changes were being made. Parents are concerned because they have every right to be when it's their child's school years that can't be made up. Once a child loses 1 or 2 years of school, There's no way to make it up. What are the flaws in English language arts? I have put these on my homepage, and I've written so much about them that you probably know them almost as well as I do. Let me just reiterate very quickly. First of all, they emphasize writing, not reading, which is backwards, because it should be the other way around. They stress informational texts, not complex literary texts, which is where analytical thinking and then critical thinking develops. They reduce literary study in the English class, which is not what English teachers have been trained to handle, something called information. That is not their particular strength. It has no list of recommended authors, literary movements, literary periods. In other words, it has no literary historical knowledge. The standards are mainly skills. And worst of all, from my point of view, having been an editor of a research journal many years ago, they're poorly written. It's very difficult to understand what it is Common Core wants taught, which is why most school administrators, when they tell their teachers they're going to be teaching to new standards, tell them the first thing they need to do is unpack them, because otherwise they won't understand what it is they're supposed to be teaching. In addition to the ELA standards in Common Core's document, we have at the very end a small set of literacy standards, which, according to David Coleman, the chief writer, was one of his more brilliant ideas, and it makes sure that teachers of history, science, math, other subjects in the curriculum will be as responsible for teaching reading and writing as English teachers. The problem is that he didn't understand what kinds of reading and writing strategies they use in these other subjects, and in his own way he has helped to ruin the history curriculum as well as the English curriculum. We had people writing these standards, and the title of the chapter I have in Hurston's book is about charlatans. We have people who didn't know what they were talking about, but who had been appointed, probably by Achieve and the Gates Foundation, to write our national standards. And they have written standards, and lo and behold, we are such a trusting people that educators all over the country think that they knew what they were doing. And it's very hard for people like me to say, these people didn't know what they were doing. They had no background in what they were doing. Why do we have to accept anything they did, even if our State Board of Ed also agreed to adopt the standards they wrote? If they didn't have any qualifications, and if the State Board never asked higher ed, which is the next piece I'm getting to, for an opinion on college readiness standards, why should local school districts even feel obligated to implement these standards? This is still, to me, a puzzling question. Where is that anti-authority, civil disobedience spirit that used to be a part of this country? It shows up everywhere else, but I don't know why. Where is higher ed in all of this? Out to lunch for the most part. In the Race to the Top application material, we did have a section that required, as it indicated, signatures from higher education presidents or chancellors. Why was that necessary? It was because part of the application material and the agreement, whether or not the state got money from Race to the Top competitive grants, part of what was designed, and the major link to higher ed, was that if students passed a grade 11 test that determined that they were college and career ready, they could, if they are admitted to college, if they want to go, they cannot be placed in remediation, in any kind of remedial course. They are to be placed in credit-bearing courses. That was the big quid pro quo. That was what all of the K-12 standards were for. How to get kids into credit-bearing courses based on a grade 11 test, for which we don't even know where the cut score will be yet. But higher ed has had no idea what was going to happen, because when these chancellors or presidents signed on, they didn't let their teaching faculty know. They just signed on. Why? Because if they were public universities or colleges, their appropriations from a state legislature, or their Pell grants, or their NSF grants, whatever might be at stake if they didn't sign on. We don't know, except that we have not heard from higher education in any concentrated, direct way. The teaching faculty, math and English, those who actually teach freshmen and sophomores, we to this day don't even know whether they know what is in Common Core and how it will affect the caliber of the students they have. This is a game that remains to be played out. As you can see, it's a work in progress. And we may start to find out next year. Wisconsin is a smarter balanced state. We don't have much information on how teachers see smarter balance as a test of what they've been teaching. We did have some information last December from one community in New Hampshire, Nashua, where we had a middle school principal named John Nelson, Fairgrounds Middle School, who asked the teachers in his middle school to take an early version of Smarter Balance in December, and then in January this past year, asked his teachers to send him their impressions and comments. And he dutifully compiled them together and was stunned. There wasn't one positive comment in the lot. And this was in math and ELA, of course. And he put them all together and posted the document, so it became public information. He also asked the New Hampshire Department of Ed and the commissioner if, as the teachers wanted, they could postpone the test until the test was revised, because the teachers didn't think it assessed what they taught, and they didn't have the technological skills for doing it very well. And even the National Teachers Union agreed that the teachers had a right to say that they didn't want to give the test when it was finally completed. So, in its own way, their own union supported the teachers and what they wanted. He didn't get anywhere with that, of course. The New Hampshire Commissioner, the Governor, Board of Ed, and his own superintendent all said, "You're giving the test this year." That wasn't the only feedback I found out about these Common Core-based tests. That feedback on Smarter Balance, I've heard nothing that was positive. But I wondered about PARCC, P-A-R-C-C, which is the test being given in Massachusetts and in maybe 10 other states. Many states have been dropping out of the testing part, the membership for Common Core. And it turns out we had an opportunity in Massachusetts to get a little feedback by an unusual event, and that was because they were given an opportunity, all local superintendents, to decide for next year whether they would continue with one more year of our state test or go to PARCC right away. And the superintendents had to report to their own local school committees. We call them school committees in Massachusetts. And a couple of local reporters actually attended those meetings and wrote up articles. First time they have really written lots of useful information. And I found one for one particular school district called Bridgewater-Rainham on the South Shore in Massachusetts, where the superintendent said she was recommending that they continue with MCAS because of the criticisms that she had gotten from her principals and others in the school system. And she listed some of the criticisms. She never would have said this in public, except for the fact that she had to tell her school committee why she was giving a recommendation for doing something, and never would have become public if there wasn't a local reporter looking for a news story. So there it was, and I looked and Googled and found a few other local newspapers in Massachusetts whose reporters had gone to the committee meetings that took place. There are others where they're also refusing to give the PARCC test next year, but they're just saying they want to continue with MCAS because it's continuity for them. They haven't dared to go beyond it, but at least they figure they'll get through next year, keeping with the same state tests they've had. In the meantime, I have heard from a state legislator's research assistant that the legislature is now thinking about what additions or changes it might make to Common Core standards. So obviously there's a little bit of play going on. Local school boards, school committees are hearing that their own teachers don't want to have a Common Core based test next year, even though they've been implementing the standards in their classroom. And the legislators are hearing from their constituents that there are some big gaps in these math and English standards that they need to address. I'm sure Wisconsin is closer to Massachusetts in that regard too. Let me talk now about some ways that different states or communities are trying to get out. At the local level, I'm sorry there isn't more action. You have a real model here in Germantown. There is one model, tiny town called Wakefield, New Hampshire, that I spent a couple of hours with, and that videotape is on my homepage, University of Arkansas. I spent several hours talking with their tiny school board in Wakefield, New Hampshire, which voted out, or actually decided it would not adopt Common Core because they have local control in New Hampshire, and they were going to adopt, which they did last spring, the old Massachusetts standards and wanted me to answer questions about it. Fine. Their superintendent was not happy with this, but nevertheless, he's the public servant who was hired by the school board. So we have to remember that he does what the school committee or school board wants him to do. And he was told to start implementing the old Massachusetts math and ELA standards. And I was there to answer their questions. They're still facing the stumbling block of what they do with the Smart Balance test that will be given this year. But this little school committee, and remember New Hampshire is the state that has on its license plate, live free or die. I'm waiting to see what happens in New Hampshire next year. I don't think anyone's going to die over this issue, but I'm waiting to see whether this little tiny town in rural New Hampshire decides that it's going to not give Common Core, or come hell or high water, it will give Common Core and not care what the results are because it's doing better by its kids anyway with whatever standards they've adopted, and they will have teacher tests that they will use for their students, which they've been doing very well with all these years anyway. So that's at the local level. Why more local districts aren't doing something, I'm not sure yet, because local control exists in almost every state except maybe Louisiana, I was told. That was where the legislature actually took away local control a couple of years ago after Katrina, because they wanted to make some big changes in New Orleans and didn't want local control posing any obstacles there. So you have local control in just about every state in this country, which goes back hundreds of years, even before territories became states, certainly in the New England colonies before they became states. And parents always had rights to do what they wanted with their children, including homeschooling. This has been one of the most interesting distortions I have yet come across, where parents are told they don't have permission to take their children out of school, to opt them out of a test. Sorry, that is not in any state statute. No, and they're told, state statute says that parents must have their children assessed by X, Y, or Z, state test. There is no state statute that says parents cannot opt their kids out. The state statutes may well say that state boards have the authority to adopt statewide tests and that local school districts must administer these tests. But it doesn't mean that parents can't opt their kids out. They have permission. They don't need to ask for permission. That's the point. They have the right to keep their kids home if they're sick, take them away on vacation, and they even have the right to send them to school with a note saying, you cannot give my child any Common Core-based test, and in place of that time on testing, I want appropriate instruction given to my child. And the more parents that do this in a school, that is what your local school board has to vote on. It's not up to your administration to say, sorry, we can't provide an instructional session, or we're going to give your kid the test no matter what note you send to us. That's not what hired professionals can do. Your local school board is the only one to make these policies, and it has to make them out in the open. But parents have every right to send in a note with their child saying, I want appropriate instruction and no Common Core-based testing whenever you give it, because there are games being played. Schools aren't telling parents when the tests are being given. There are all kinds of little games that are now being played, because part of the idea is apparently to placate these unruly parents who think they know what's best for their own children. So we have the local issues, we have the parent issues, and what's happening at the state level. And I'm going to end with that because I can always answer more questions later. We have a couple of models, and I'll describe them very briefly. I'm involved in both states, Oklahoma and Ohio, where state legislators are trying to have revision committees to develop stronger standards for their state and Common Core. Oklahoma, as you probably know, had a governor, Mary Fallon, who signed off on a bill that was developed. And she signed off a couple of months ago, and Oklahoma's model is to go back to the standards they had as the interim set of standards while revision committees move forward developing stronger standards for Oklahoma in a 2-year period. What's happening in Oklahoma, and I go there at the end of the month to talk about my procedural plan for how you set up these revision committees so you don't get warmed over Common Core coming back again. There we have a Board of Ed that adopted Common Core, supported by people in most bureaucracies, which we have for state departments of education, and they're honeycombed with Common Core supporters. So the Common Core supporters with the State Board of Ed who supported Common Core tried to file a lawsuit against the legislature for daring to get rid of Common Core in Oklahoma and lost the lawsuit. In any event, State Board of Ed has decided it will not have the steering committee specified by the legislation itself. But they are concerned that there are a lot of people in Oklahoma, they've been hearing from the parents, who don't want Common Core. So they're willing to listen to my procedures at the end of the month when I go there, and then they'll see how they set up 2 committees. And I've said you've got to start out, number 1, with chairs that come from higher ed, because the whole point of college readiness standards is to get students supposedly to be ready for college. So you find a chair from your math, science, or engineering departments, and another chair from your English language or literature departments. And if they choose old cronies from some other place, then they're clearly violating the spirit of the law, and the parents are going to let them know. So that's the Oklahoma model. Ohio is trying something different. About a month or so ago, they had a hearing. Their state legislator, Andy Thompson is his name, helped to develop a bill that was being heard by the Rules and Regulations Committee, because it wasn't going to be heard by the right committee, the Education Committee, which was for Common Core. So that's a piece of the politics within each state. And he's got a bill that says we get rid of Common Core, and in the interim, we adopt the old pre-2009 Massachusetts standards for 2 years, while Ohio develops its own standards. So the procedures that I've outlined for Oklahoma could apply to Ohio. It's what the state wants to do in the interim. And of course, it is hearing from Common Core supporters saying, oh, this is a terrible thing to do to our teachers in schools. They're going to have 3 different sets of standards over a period of 3 to 4 years. And I've been trying to explain that actually, if a state adopts for an interim period of 2 years, the old Massachusetts standards, which I know almost by heart in my sleep, it will save money and it will be a lot better for the kids in the schools, because we create standards that teachers could step into based on their disciplinary training and background, and it won't cost anywhere near the amount of professional development money that it's costing states and districts to retrain their current teachers for Common Core standards. They represent a whole new ballpark, mainly ineffective or strategies that haven't been shown to be effective. So you've got serious problems with the fact that you'll never be able to really judge whether Common Core is working, because teachers have been trained and will be continuing to be trained on using strategies that have no basis in any body of credible research to do them. So here we have the Ohio model, the Oklahoma model. South Carolina has also voted out, it thinks, Common Core, its legislature. However, its State Department of Ed is busy creating committees that will give it back, warmed over version of Common Core, just as Indiana's revision committees did. I was involved briefly with Indiana, and Governor Pence played a nice little game. On one hand, he said he was getting rid of Common Core, and then he allowed deliberately the creation of revision committees that gave them back a warmed over version of Common Core. So Indiana has now ended up with some of the worst standards in the country, because the committees that were put into place were so incompetent they couldn't even paraphrase Common Core's poorly written standards well, and ended up with even more poorly written standards than they were. And this was as true in math as it was in English, because when they asked 2 different mathematicians from each side of the spectrum, so to speak, to comment on the final version of the math, both mathematicians, Wu is one, Milgram is the other, both said that they were incoherent. So they've ended up with what used to be among the best math standards in the country, with now the worst math standards in the country. That's quite an accomplishment for Governor Pence. And now he's running on that as a record, I understand. I mean, to me, this is one of the humorous parts of all of this, is that Indiana could have gone back to the 2006 standards, which even the mathematicians at Indiana University said were fine, just needed some tweaking. But instead, he had warmed over Common Core standards brought back again. Why? To satisfy the waiver that the Department of Ed under Arnie Duncan had given, which requires use of Common Core standards. They would have lost the waiver, which is, of course, what Duncan told Oklahoma it was doing. It was losing its waiver, which is what set off all the games with this Board of Ed. So you have a lot of political games going on as states try to get out of this sticky jar of molasses, as I say, for the Common Core and its tentacles and the data collection. And I'm going to stop here, and later on you can feel free to ask any further questions about these or others, but we have more important information to be giving that relate to some of these other tentacles on the data collection.